I have been passionate about distilling for decades. I've learned a lot along this journey. The saying, you don't know what you don't know, certainly applied to my journey. I had a good foundation in nature. I grew up in rural Wyoming in the USA. As a child, I was free to explore and roam the countryside. Nature is a wise teacher. I've always been curious by nature, so it should be of no surprise that I applied that curiosity to distillation. I would like to share with you my distillation journey. I wrote this poem at the first Botanica 2012 in Dublin, Ireland. The Hydrosol Song begins with a precious note. It is soon joined by many as a light and airy fluid drips from the still. The melody becomes more and more complex as the deeper, heavier molecules join in. Soon, a symphony of notes joins together to become a full-bodied hydrosol. When I began my distillation journey many years ago, there was not an abundance of information on the subject. There were only a few books, and the internet searches were not what they are today. I was introduced to distillation during a United Plant Savers workshop back in the early 90s. James Green was demonstrating how to make a rose hydrosol from kitchen equipment, and I was intrigued. I came home from this workshop with a thirst for learning more about distilling plants. Hydrosols seemed a perfect fit for my interest in growing and using medicinal herbs. My research led me to Jeannie Rose, who's been my mentor and friend for all these years. I learned how to distill on a copper alembic from Jeannie when she came to our local lavender festival and did a demonstration. I began to learn about chemistry of these distillate waters from Larry Jones of Spectric Labs. He was patient with this curious girl who didn't even know what questions to ask, but he patiently pointed me in the right direction to learn more. My path was seemingly set for a wonderful journey with plants, copper, water, and distillation. As I began to teach and have my own students, I realized there were four things I always relied on. These are what I call the four pillars. To know your plants, know your equipment, know your product, and last but not least, know yourself. I use these four pillars as a foundation for my work. So what does it mean to know your plants? For my part, it means to research the botanical that I want to work with, to be aware of its at-risk status. It is to understand sustainability issues and to be able to identify the plant you're working with during all stages of growth. I was born into plants. It would be true to say that I've been around plants all my life. I've admired them, studied them, grown them, and I've used medicinal herbs on my friends and family for most of my life. So I came to distilling with a firm knowledge of plants. To know the plant is to respect the plant. I respect the plants I work with enough to research them before I choose whether or not to distill them. I begin by learning about their native habitat. Where do they like to grow? Do they like sun or shade? Do they provide habitat of food for wildlife? Where did the plant originate? I use the Latin binomial to avoid any confusion. You can learn a lot about a plant from its Latin name. I check the current accepted name through several taxonomic databases to ensure that I am using the most up-to-date name. I look at its use as a medicinal plant. Is it used in teas and decoctions, which would indicate to me that it might have water-soluble constituents? Is it considered an aromatic and distilled for the essential oil? What type of published research is there on this botanical? What is the anecdotal evidence? I also consider what is the best use for the particular plant. Is it more effective as a tea, an infused herb, or a hydrosol? St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum, is a good example. It is known for its beautiful carmine-colored hypericin that's found in the flowers. However, this constituent is not water-soluble and it does not come over in the distillation. The hydrosol has different properties and the distillation can yield a very valuable essential oil. I choose to distill a small amount of St. John's wort for the hydrosol, but I mostly use the plant as an infused oil. I spend time with the plant before I make a decision on whether or not to distill it. Distilling takes a lot of resources, and I want to make sure that I'm using them wisely. Before I put plant material in my still, I also research its at-risk status. I use the CITES database, which stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, for information on worldwide plants. I use the United Plant Savers for North American native plants. Both organizations help me stay informed of a plant's status. If a plant that I'm interested in is considered endangered, I will either find an alternative or will research cultivating this particular botanical. White sage, Salvia apiana, is a good example. I love working with this plant, but it is endangered in the wild. It has been over-harvested. I began researching whether it was suited for cultivation. It is a drought-tolerant plant, so it seems very happy in my area. It is, however, too tender to survive the winters, so I take cuttings each fall and I overwinter the plants in my greenhouse, ready to plant for the next spring. When it comes to sustainability, the term may mean different things to different people. I recently read a post in a distilling group about some folks who wildcrafted a large amount of yarrow from some private land. They distilled it for a very small amount of essential oil, and they did not keep the hydrosol. For me, that was not sustainable on any level, from the overharvesting to the waste of water for the distillation and the waste of the hydrosol. These same folks considered themselves conscientious wildcrafters and very mindful, so it appears there may be different ideas on what sustainability may be. For me, sustainability is not just about wildcrafting. I also consider sustainability of cultivating plants. What are the farming practices do I need to use to cultivate this particular plant? For instance, draining a wetland to grow a drought-tolerant plant is not sustainable to me, but I've seen it happen. I have always been an organic farmer, but I have to take into consideration whether a plant is suited to my particular environment. I live in a hot, semi-arid climate, so I choose not to grow plants that prefer a maritime environment. I am very conscious of water usage. I maintain a large garden off of our well, so I am mindful of how much water I use. I do not waste water by overhead watering, but instead rely on a drip irrigation system, which is best suited for my sandy soil. When it comes to wildcrafting, I'm very conscious about what plants I choose to harvest. I have witnessed that proper wildcrafting can actually enhance the biome. Achille mellifolium, our local yarrow, grew somewhat sparsely in our open meadow. I began wildcrafting it 15 years ago. The first year, I only harvested a few plants for an infused oil as I felt there wasn't enough to harvest more than that, but I spread seeds from the other plants. Over the years, the yarrow has spread and is now abundant and covers the same field with white flowers in June. I consider ethics when wildcrafting. I know what part of the plant to harvest. If it is an above ground part, perhaps I can harvest a small amount from several plants. If it is a root, I consider very carefully whether to take the life of the plant is in the best use of that plant. Root medicine is very powerful. I consider how much I can harvest from a particular area. If the plant is considered invasive and harmful to the native plants, I might overharvest it and spread native plant seeds in its stead. If it is sparsely populated, I may choose not to harvest, but rather spread its seed instead. I seldom harvest on public land, but if I do, I get the required permits, and I always consider that I may not be the only harvester. I am 100% positive of the plant's identity before I ever consider wildcrafting that plant. In medicine, there is a saying, first, do no harm. This also applies to herbalism and distillation. You can do a lot of harm if you don't know the plant you are putting in your still. I educate myself on lookalikes. There are many in the plant world. I was fortunate to have learned not only Latin, but also how to key out plants when I studied botany at college. I've had seed mislabeled so that the plant I thought I was growing was something entirely different, but I was able to identify it so I didn't pass along the mistake to my customers. I use Latin binomials so there is no confusion with common names. Using common names when dealing with plants is a risky business. In my area, we have an abundance of tansy, Tanacetum vulgare. It would be easy and dangerous to confuse it with a blue tansy, the Tanacetum annum. Since the two plants have very different chemistry, using the correct Latin name and positive identification is the best practice. I educate myself as to what plant part is beneficial. Sometimes, as we know, this can be more than one part of the plant. Likewise, different parts of the plant might have different chemistry and uses. Over the years, I've learned how the season, the time of day, and the phenological stage can affect the plant and its chemistry. A good example of this is my native balsam root, Balsamorrhiza sagittata. This is an abundant plant in my area, so I'm able to harvest the root. I harvest the root in the spring to tincture for an expectorant, and again in the fall for its antimicrobial properties. Traditionally, the two tinctures are then mixed together. It is up to me to decide how to put the plant to best use. It is ultimately the distiller's responsibility to educate themselves on identification, medicinal value, and sustainability of the plants they want to distill. This is the tale of two composites. When I was distilling for production, I often contracted organic farmers. This particular year, I had contracted a farmer in southeastern Washington to grow German chamomile for me, Matricaria chamomilla. She did a wonderful job, and the first couple 100 pounds she sent were gorgeous. I had distilled those and ordered more to be shipped in. Something was wrong with the next distillation. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I trusted this grower, and as the distillation kept going, I knew that something was very wrong. It smelled way different than German chamomile. So I re-examined the box of chamomile she had sent me. Everything looked to order, but I kept smelling a very off note. When I examined much more closely, I realized that she had also harvested Anthemus cotula, or what we call dog fennel, which is also called stinking mayweed. So when I called her to ask what was going on, I asked her if this was from her farm. She said, yes, this is the chamomile I grew, but I also wildcrafted some because it grows wild all around me. Well, what had happened was she assumed that the stinking mayweed was German chamomile and had harvested that and mixed it in with the German chamomile she'd cultivated. So I learned a very valuable lesson. I have to be 100% positive of what I put in my still, and I had not examined that box of chamomile closely enough. So that wasted my time, my water, and a lot of plant material, and the hydrosol had to go on the compost pile because it was not saleable. So this was a lesson learned. Know your plants. Distilling good quality essential oils and hydrosols begins with having a good quality still. Today we have many choices from whom we can buy a still. We can choose different manufacturers from around the globe. We have choices on what materials we want to work with, including hybrids such as stainless steel and copper. We can choose from many different sizes and design styles. When it comes to quality, one must choose wisely. Over the many years that I've been distilling, I've acquired more than 20 stills for my students to use during workshops and for my own personal use. Over the years, I've seen major differences in quality between different manufacturers. I've even seen a difference in quality coming from the same manufacturer. It is important when distilling for commerce that one practices due diligence by vetting the manufacturer of your still. Unfortunately, not all manufacturers will stand by their product or be truthful in advertising. I use the same due diligence for purchasing a still as I would for purchasing an essential oil or hydrosol. Caveat emptor. I have stills that range in size from 3 liters to 150 liters. It is important for me to have different sizes so that I can distill for best use. I wouldn't use a 3-liter still to distill the 35 kilos of lavender that I grow. It would not be the best use of my time or resources. I would also not use my 150-liter still to distill a small batch of wild roses. I choose my size of my still for the job at hand. Besides quality and size, we have many types of materials from which to choose. I have distilled on glass, copper, stainless, and even clay. Each material has its own pros and cons, and some materials are better suited for some tasks than others. When choosing the material for my distillation, I consider many things, including the end use of what I'm distilling. This is an individual choice, and I enjoy exploring how the different materials react with different plants and styles of distilling. Just as we have different materials to choose from, we also have different styles of distillation equipment to choose from. Each style also has pros and cons, and some are better suited for certain distillations than others. For instance, a still designed for alcohol distillation may not be the best choice for an essential oil or hydrosol distillation. Over the years, I've experimented with different styles and types of distillation. I find it a personal choice of combining the style, the material, and the type of distillation to get the best product possible. This is the tale of the leaded Aquitar. I had never doubted the quality of my stills until 2016. A friend of mine had come back from a trip to India where she had seen some lead-lined stills. They had lined the stills because the copper had gotten very thin due to use. This had both of us concerned about how that would affect the hydrosols and essential oils. I wanted to have some of the hydrosols analyzed, so I purchased a few dozen hydrosols from different parts of the globe. I chose one of my hydrosols that I had distilled on my 10-liter Aquitar as the control for this experiment. To say that I was surprised when it came back as positive for lead would be a vast understatement. I was devastated. How could my hydrosol have so much lead in it? I set about trying to discover the source. The picture on the right is the hat of the Aquitar that I cut in half. Yes, I cut the hat in two so that I could see the inside. You can see the solder used is silver gray in color. I had this solder analyzed and it came back very high in lead, even though the manufacturer had guaranteed 100% lead free. This was one of my most painful lessons, but now I test every still I purchase to make sure that I'm producing a safe product. It was a lesson learned. Know your equipment. It was nearly 5 years before I took the leap, which was selling a product. I wanted to make sure that I had made the best product I could and that it was safe. My friends and family helped me along this journey by sampling and giving feedback on my products. They let me know if the product worked. They let me know when it didn't work. They taught me to keep good records and to always write down my formulas. For me, one of the most important things that I could do for my customers when I was selling products was to make sure my manufacturing practices were safe and effective. When I first started selling hydrosols, there wasn't a booklet to tell me what to do. I started by designing good manufacturing protocols for my organic certification. I then added to those protocols after I learned more about microbiology. When I was producing hydrosols to sell, I chose to keep a sample from every batch. I stored these for a year. I would always be able to go back and test for microbial growth and to compare if a customer ever had an issue with a batch that I had sent out. I knew nothing of the chemistry of hydrosols when I first started distilling. I was fortunate to have great mentors along the way. In order to be a better distiller, I invested in analyses of my products. The benefit was twofold. As I learned more and more about microbiology and chemistry, I was able to educate my customers and myself. All of this investment led to my database of over 200 analyses of hydrosols. I also had to learn the proper uses for my hydrosols and also how to correctly label them. For me to be able to sell my product, I had to know my product and be able to educate others. This is the tale of salesmanship. I've never been good at sales. I'm not able to write flowery descriptions. I have to have 100% confidence in the product I'm selling. And in order to do that, I had to know my product inside and out. I had to teach myself about the chemistry. I had to be confident that it was microbial free. And I did that by investing in analyses. Before I sold anything, I knew that it had already been tested for microbial growth. And for the most part, I knew something about the chemistry for each one of the 50 hydrosol varieties that I sold. I didn't necessarily get an analysis for every batch, but I learned what was a typical analysis for a particular variety of hydrosol. So this was a lesson learned. Know your product. Knowing yourself and being honest with yourself may be one of the hardest pillars to stand on. For me, it was really important to get good training and lots of experience before I sold hydrosols. I had distilled for over 5 years before I felt I had enough experience and confidence to sell a hydrosol. I thought that was only fair to my customers that I knew I was making the best product I could. I think it's important for the industry to be the best we can be by experience, ethics, and continuing education. In the beginning, there was so much I didn't know, but I was willing to learn. When you start on a journey like this, it's hard to even know what questions to ask. There were lots of failures, even some burden stills, but from each experience, I learned something. I became a distiller through experience, gaining confidence, education, and strict ethics. This is the tale of the Lavender Tea. That's a picture of me from many, many years ago with the very first still I ever owned. I'd only been distilling a few times when this picture was taken. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, whereby our confidence soars in the beginning until we understand that we know very little, and that confidence sinks and only begins to grow again as we get experience. Well, in this picture, I had a lot of confidence with only a few distillations under my belt. I thought this was a piece of cake. There was nothing to this distillation business at all. It was easy. You just put plants in the still with some water, and magically it comes out the other end. In the beginning, for those first few distillations, I watched the still diligently. I didn't take my eyes off of it. I was very, very involved in the distillation. But by the sixth distillation, I figured this was so easy, I didn't need to pay that much attention to it. So I actually took a phone call during a distillation of lavender. And I began talking on the phone and not watching my still. For a few what only seemed like a few seconds, I had my back turned to the still. When I turned back around, I had very hot, brown, fragrant lavender tea shooting out the condenser. I had had the heat turned up too high, and I hadn't been cooling the condenser, so it had boiled through and was shooting out this very fragrant tea. So I have learned not to ever turn my back on the still and to be very involved from the beginning to the end, start to finish. Lesson learned. Know yourself. These 4 pillars have been a great foundation for my distillation journey, and I try to share their benefit with my students, knowing and respecting the plants that we work with, making sure we have safe, quality equipment, knowing the chemistry and the safe usage of our products, learning and discovering ourselves with each distillation. I know that I'm not the same person as the girl in the previous photo. Distillation has a way of peeling away the layers of the distiller. This distillation journey has been a blessing. I have met folks from around the globe that share my enthusiasm for the art. I am honored to be able to have shared some of that journey with you. Lesson learned.